Hello and welcome. I'm Brent Glass, Interim Executive Director of the National Building Museum. Thank you for joining us as we celebrate the museum's 40th anniversary this week. And I'm particularly excited to see tonight's program as a former State Historic Preservation Officer. On December 12, 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed Public Law 96-515, which established a national museum of the building arts, whose home would be in the historic Pension Building. Since that time, the museum's mission evolved and expanded in scope and scale, but it has always been unique to serve as the country's only cultural institution dedicated to the built environment. For 4 decades, we've presented celebrated exhibitions that have addressed a wide range of subjects, from design and construction to advances in sustainability and resilience to social justice issues. Our award-winning team programs have engaged and empowered younger generations with the knowledge and tools to advocate for a better built world. And our prestigious public programs have engaged with world-famous designers, industry leaders, and other notables through a variety of formats. I am delighted to be a part of this week's celebration and to share examples of what we have been doing for the past 40 years. I want to give a special thank you to CoStar Group and all of our 40th anniversary donors for making this birthday week of free programming possible. If you enjoy tonight's program, please consider joining the museum with a year-end gift. And if you're not a member already, please consider joining our membership program. You will get early access with discounts to other museum programs and events. And if you're already a member, thank you for your support. It directly helps our ability to create world-class programs and exhibitions. This holiday season, you can also gift a membership to family and friends. And please visit our outstanding museum shop. In my opinion, the best museum shop in DC. You can visit our website, nbm.org, for more details about the shop and all of our programs. Now it is my pleasure to introduce John Sprinkle, Adjunct Associate Professor, School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland.
I am John Sprinkle, and it is my great pleasure to serve as the moderator tonight. With Emily Eig and Scott Paden, we do have 2 dynamic speakers to be followed, hopefully, with wonderful questions from the audience. To really understand the import and impact of the creation of the National Building Museum 40 years ago, one needs a little context. After World War II, one of the most pressing historic preservation issues in the United States was indeed, what do we do with the growing number of great big white elephants, those federal courthouses, custom houses, post offices, and office buildings that had been supplanted by new construction during the 20th century. In fact, surplus federal property issues were at the center of many of the transformations associated with the new preservation that evolved during the 1960s. Conventions such as the codification of the so-called 50-year rule, the creation of the National Historic Landmark Program, and the establishment of the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation each had their origins as part of a federal surplus building story. Now, in the days before World War II, the fate of surplus federal buildings was a seemingly simple affair. In 1938, all it took was a passionate telegram from Philadelphia Museum Director Fisk Kimball to the Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes for the Second Bank of the United States, a William Strickland design, to be saved from private sale and likely demolition. Its subsequent rehabilitation by a nonprofit organization laid the foundation for policies that allowed for the transfer of historic federal properties at no cost to state and local groups as museums. The gift, indeed, of a great white elephant. In the post-war period, the transfer of such monumental buildings became more complicated. For over a decade, the National Park Service unsuccessfully pursued the old San Francisco Mint for use as its Western regional headquarters. Here, the Attorney General had to weigh in as to which federal policy, surplus property disposal or adaptive use of historic buildings, took precedence. And it was frustration with the General Services Administration's reluctance to consider the historical significance of the massive building that helped foster the creation of the National Historic Landmark Program. Later, in the late 1960s, a politically motivated transfer to San Francisco State University, one requested by President Nixon himself, put the building center stage during a controversial meeting of the newly established Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Soon, a constellation of surplus property cases, including one tied to Alfred Mullet's old custom house in St. Louis, led President Nixon to issue Executive Order 11593 in May 1971, which directed agencies to identify and evaluate their portfolio of historic properties, and thus in many ways created the business of cultural resource management that we know today. It also provided the mandate for the development of the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. During the early 1970s, another great white elephant was included in efforts to enhance détente with the Soviet Union. Returning from the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty talks, President Nixon expressed interest in Russian historic preservation practices. In Washington, D.C., the old post office on Pennsylvania Avenue, a property which had long been criticized for its inefficient design, was selected as a proposed joint venture with the Soviets in adaptive reuse. From this very brief overview, you can see that surplus federal buildings, like the old pension building, have presented a continuing series of challenges for the historic preservation movement. Many great and some not so great buildings were lost in the third quarter of the 20th century, but some were saved and found a new life. By the late 1970s, the appreciation for the diverse values embodied by such monumental architecture and their potential to contribute to the next generation was increasingly apparent. As noted at the time by Loretta Newman, one important goal of the preservation movement was to harmonize the policies of government so that conflicts between surplus property disposal and the adaptive use of historic buildings were erased. As we've heard, legislatively created during a lame duck session of Congress as part of the transformational 1980 amendments to the National Historic Preservation Act, a story that is also worthy of recall, tonight we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the creation of the National Building Museum, a property no longer considered a great white elephant, or as Megs's old red barn, but rather as an essential part of our nation's capital, as well as our nation's culture. Next, we'll hear from the architectural historian Emily Eig, who will talk about the history of the building and its architecture, followed by the architect Scott Paden, who will describe recent work at the building. Emily, the Zoom is yours.
Hello to everyone tonight. The excitement of dealing with these webinars can never be replaced, because what we miss is, in fact, being in this beautiful building. And I'm sorry that we're not here to actually experience it, and I'm also sorry I don't have as great a background as John does, but I will hope to bring to you this building and make it come alive a little bit as we proceed tonight. I want to thank a lot of people who provided a lot of good information that I was able to share, and I hope in the slides, and I hope that you will enjoy. So let us begin. Following the Civil War, DC experienced a tremendous growth in population. And in 1870, Alexander Boss Shepherd began an intensive program to improve the district. His public works included roads being paved, sewer systems installed, street trees being planted, and parks beautified, most of which we still enjoy today and think of as the beautiful capital city. But it was also a time when the federal government was expanding and appropriations were made to create new federal buildings. Next slide. So the buildings that were designed came in a variety of styles from the late Victorian period. We have buildings such as State War and Navy from the 1870s, the Old National Museum, which is now Arts and Industries, from 1879, Bureau of Engraving by James Greenhill in 1880, and then of course the pension building that we're here to discuss tonight that was built in 1883. This eclectic style of architecture came to a halt, though, as we got to the turn of the century with the Macmillan Plan, and thereafter federal buildings and monuments were constructed in a neoclassical style. And it is probably this shift in what Washington should look like that brought so much pain to the pension building and to decisions as to what its future should be. But before we move from these buildings, let's talk about what is a pension building. We are here to discuss the idea of this building, but what is a pension? Well, these pensions were in fact money that and land grants that were offered to veterans who had been disabled in the course of military services, or to their widows and the orphans of the officers who were killed. Prior to the Civil War, most pensions were related to the Revolutionary War, obviously, the War of 1812, or maybe the Mexican-American War, but they were mostly paid by state governments due to the fact that many veterans served for the militaries formed by states rather than for the federal government itself. But by 1864, things had changed dramatically, and approximately 93% of the pensioners on the rolls had served in the Civil War for the federal government. And this number continued to rise over the next several decades. So not only did the Civil War greatly increase the number of parishioners, the war also created a demand for federal workers and office space to administer the pension program. In 1881, understanding that there was a need for a new building that could house the growing pension bureau, which at that time was just a department within the Department of Interior, Congress commissioned the construction of a building specifically to meet the needs of the Bureau. They appointed 65-year-old U.S. Army Quartermaster General Montgomery C. Megs, who was on the verge of retirement, to serve as both architect and engineer for the building. They tasked him with designing a fireproof building and authorized $250,000 for its expenditure. Megs not only was a talented designer, but he was an innovator of 19th century building technology. He was born in 1816 and died in 1892, born in Atlanta, grew up in Philadelphia, attended West Point, where he, at the age of 16, and graduated top of his class. Within a few years of graduating, he began working at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But at age 36, he was assigned to a project that had the goal of determining the best means of supplying water to the city of Washington and Georgetown, and thus began his work on the Washington Aqueduct. You'll see in my slides here the Cabin John Bridge, which at the time was the longest stone arch bridge in the world at 220 feet, the Rock Creek Bridge that carried water between the city of Washington and Georgetown. And these are familiar to us, to say the least. But he also went on to serve as the supervising engineer for the expansion of the U.S. Capitol, working with architect Thomas U. Walter, sometimes not so congenially. But the dome that we see today is the product of their cooperation. During the Civil War, he served as the Quartermaster General of the Army. And you may not know that it was his decision and his idea to build a cemetery around the Robert E. Lee's mansion in Arlington when the Confederacy fell, so that it would never be a usable home again. Before he received the commission to design the pension building, he had traveled to Italy and drew his inspiration for the building design from Italian Renaissance palaces, most notably Antonio de Sangallo's Farnese Palace in Rome. On the left, you'll see the exterior and interior courtyard images of the palazzo, and on the right, the pension building exterior and the interior courtyard. A major difference is that the courtyard at the pension building is closed, whereas it is open at the palazzo. But you can see the similarities of the two buildings very clearly. The construction began in 1882, and the photograph on the left, which Scott Paden found for me, which I appreciate greatly, is of this excavation site. And you can see that around this site, rather than the large government buildings we see today, there were large row houses because it was in fact a residential area. The 1883 photograph on the right is one of my favorites because it shows you how a true masonry building is constructed. As you can see, not only did the windows and decorative detail of the framing go in, but the decorative frieze itself that we see on the building and columns were built along the way. So it was a finished product as they moved along, very different than how we build a building today. The three bottom photographs show us the creation of the columns and how the building was sort of built from the inside out almost. And then finally on the right is where the roof is placed on top of these columns. really fabulous opportunity to see what goes on. And in fact, the building, while aesthetically associated with the Renaissance, was aimed at providing a modern experience that would provide comfort and efficiency for office workers and visitors alike. Obviously, fire resistance, but also the building incorporated cutting-edge ventilation and circulation techniques, many of which developed by Megs himself. The drawing on the upper right shows you how the air circulation came in from the bottom and went out up through clerestory windows, not part of the original palazzo design, but something that Megs came up with himself. This allowed for both ventilation and heat and air to circulate through the building. His response to this distaste for government office buildings that had long, dark, stuffy hallways, he wound up designing a hallway that opened directly onto the Great Hall for maximum light and air as well. And in recognition of the thousands of disabled veterans who would have to climb the stairs between the floors when they went to pick up their checks, but not to accommodate the horses, as is often recounted, the brick stairs that were set with unusually wide treads, shallow risers, and a slight cant. This represents a very early attempt to make the building accessible to these disabled men, 150 years before the ADA was enacted. The 8 colossal 75-foot high, 8 foot in diameter, and 25 feet in circumference colossal columns are constructed of brick like the rest of the building. Each column was built of 70,000 bricks and topped by a molded plaster Corinthian capital. Megs wanted to face them in marble, but the budget led to a simpler plaster finish, originally whitewashed, although in 1895 they were painted to resemble Sienna marble. A fun fact is that these Corinthian columns were the tallest columns in the world when they were built. Other decorative details abounded, and if we were in the building, we could see most of them, but we would see the fountain, and we would see copies of the 244 life-size busts that were originally located in the niches high atop the Great Hall's central bay. But beyond the aesthetics, the problem associated with managing a vast amount of paper led Megs to devise a, quote, special document moving system, as he called it, that whisked baskets around rails that ran the perimeter on each floor. Today, these rails are still visible on the top 4th floor. A dumbwaiter system provided for convenient vertical circulation between the floors. Megs was obviously quite interested in the idea of the paper that was here. And I will actually remind everyone, these are the stairs on the right that people say were for horses, but were not. They were for the disabled veterans. One of the most interesting things is that there are countless government documents that Megs stashed away inside the hollow columns of the 1st and 2nd floor arcades, which he thought would be interesting to historians or antiquarians in the age when, quote, the ruins of this building shall be open to the curious. In 1995, volunteer Dick Metcalf got the idea to investigate, and sure enough, the documents were discovered. And if you were to take a tour of the building today, you would actually be able to poke your eyes in to see these documents, because they've opened the area up so that it is possible for everyone to have an understanding of the time capsule that Megs put together. In 1885, the Pension Bureau began moving into the building, even though it would not be completed for 2 more years. By the time it was completed in 1887, construction had risen to almost $890,000. Over 15 million bricks were used, making it the largest brick building in the world. And for those of you who like statistics, the building footprint is 400 by 200 feet. The Great Hall is 316 by 116 feet. The space that was created could accommodate approximately 1,500 clerks and officers who serviced 890,000 union pensioner claims from the beginning. Interestingly and timely by today's culture, we understand here is that Confederate soldiers and their dependents were not eligible for pensions from the federal government until 1958. However, Southerners were eligible if they fought in other wars. Despite the monumentality of Meg's achievement, the building was quickly dubbed Meg's Red Barn, and it met with complaint by one of the generals that it was, quote, it was too bad that the damn thing is fireproof. Congressman jumped on the bandwagon, referring to it as a, quote, architectural monstrosity, a cross between a horse car stable and a Union depot, And one claimed that not only was it offensive to the vision, but that it, quote, presented ornamentation that should be blown up with dynamite. But interestingly, Senator Charles McMillan, who would later chair the committee that would create the McMillan Plan of 1902, and Speaker of the House Joe Cannon, found the building comfortable, well ventilated, and, to quote, better adapted to its purposes than any public building in Washington. But Megs envisioned this to be more than an office building. He saw it, in fact, as a Civil War memorial. He commissioned the Bohemian-born American sculptor Caspar Boubert to create a 1,200-foot long by 3-foot-high terracotta frieze to extend around the building. The sculptor Boubert is someone we could actually spend an entire program discussing, but I will leave you to research his many accomplishments on your own. But know about the frieze that was executed by the Boston Terracotta Company. It's an early use of ornamental terracotta, which was considered an affordable substitute for carved stone or iron. The frieze depicts the continuous parade of more than 1,300 figures presented in Civil War military units with 6 themes: infantry, cavalry, artillery, navy, medicine, and quartermaster, represented in 28 panels, repeated in varying ways to create the unbroken procession. And another interesting fact is that the western gate is known as the gate of the quartermaster, the southern is the gate of the infantry, east is the naval gate, and the north is the gate of the invalids. So next time you are able to visit, remember which door you go in. But more than just an office building and a memorial, it was also an event space. Due to the vast size of the Great Hall, it was quickly identified as a place to use for events, most notably inaugural balls, 19 and counting at this time. Even before it was finished, it was the scene of the inaugural ball for President Grover Cleveland. Other presidents included Harrison, Cleveland again, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Clinton, and Obama. Perhaps in this coming year, it would be nice if we could actually have an inaugural ball there, but we will see. The Pension Bureau itself remained in the building between 1885 and 1926. But following World War I, the Pension Bureau was consolidated with other agencies and became part of the U.S. Veterans Administration. In 1930, the General Accounting Office took over the building. They quickly ran out of space, and plans were approved to expand the building to the south, but they were abandoned with concerns that the expansion would take away needed space from the courts that were then about to be constructed. The GAO remained in the building until 1950, at which point its new modern building, which is in the lower part of our screen here, across the street to the north, was opened and ready for use. It was built not on the Judiciary Square reservation, but rather on land that was collected by eminent domain by the government to use for the site of that new building. The pension building itself continued as office space for a variety of government offices, but the expectation that it would actually wind up being demolished grew. But let's see what happened. How was, in fact, the pension building saved? And in fact, we can say very strongly it was the preservation movement itself. In 1876, with the centennial, DC dignitaries, as other places around the country, other people, published a list of landmark buildings that they thought should be preserved, that they were special buildings. At the turn of the century, this happened again. There were many lists that we've discovered over time of buildings that they thought were important. And in 1959, as the bicentennial started to draw attention, the American Institute of Architects drew up a list of notable buildings, recommending them, quote, to public attention as architecture worth saving on the local scene, unquote. Buildings on the must-save list included the State War and Navy Building, the Arts and Industry Building, the Blair Lee House, among others, and of course, the Pension Building. This interest in the past would soon grow through the legislation that would happen. In DC, the 1964, an inventory of historic places was created. And in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act passed that created the National Register of Historic Places, among many other aspects of preservation, including the Section 106 and the Advisory Council. In 1978, DC passed a law that was the strongest preservation law in the country because it prohibited demolition without very specific standards being met. So how did this actually affect the pension building? Well, the pension building itself was listed on the DC inventory in 64. It was listed on the register in 69. 85, it became a National Historic Landmark. It was documented by the Historic American Building Survey, and it's also considered as a contributing resource to the L'Enfant Plan and the Pennsylvania Avenue National Historic Site. This interest in the building was obviously quite intense. However, as we'll see in the next slide, that did not affect people's attitude about what its future should be. There was still talk of demolishing it. They came up with some other ideas, and one was that plans for an air museum, which is now what we call Air and Space, was supposed to be on the mall, but one of the congressmen at the time said, wait a minute, why don't we put this new museum in the pension building? It will be a showplace for the Air Age collection, and it would save the government $40 million. There were also ideas that it would in fact become the new Museum of American History and Technology, an idea that was being batted around for the mall. And Frank Taylor, a man whose photograph is here, was put in the job of actually determining whether the pension building could be a museum. And it was his learned opinion that it was absolutely not suitable to be a museum. It couldn't meet humidification requirements. It didn't have access to take large exhibits in and out. It was not good for people for meeting building codes, and he rejected the idea. And of course, you know, he became the director of the Museum of History and Technology that is there. He also later became the director of the Air and Space before he retired. So the building then was left without a use. People became more and more concerned. And in fact, they pressured the General Services Administration to do a study. Clotilde Woodard Smith, an architect, DC, was commissioned to understand the building. She studied it in great length and put together an elaborate report on it. She was a modernist architect. She was an urban planner. And with Louis Justement, she had developed plans for the redevelopment of Southwest. And if there's any example of where we have removed historic buildings to replace them with new ones, it certainly was her plan for the Southwest. But that was not her intention for what she thought the pension building's future should be. She had opened her own firm in 63, and by 71, it was the largest female-run architectural firm in the US, and so she had a bit of clout. Her report, she proffered, say, it may well be that this is a special building that has special needs. And I'm going to read some of the report, which she wrote. Times change, and today we have a chance to find a way to use this great building that will, quote unquote, restore it so that we can enjoy its special qualities. We have all too few buildings in the capital city that bring the past century to us. We have the State War and Navy, and I'm obviously shortening this here, the Smithsonian, but in another part of town, well north of the mall, and either left out or shadowed with clouds in the renderings of the city made after the turn of the century, there isn't such a clear use for the pension building. It was built as an accounting office. Clerks, not admirals or generals or diplomats or famous scientists or artists, worked in the high-ceilinged rooms around the great courtyard. Hundreds of desks were there, not reception rooms and carpeted private offices and great conference rooms. In a very real sense, she found, it was a building in search of a client. It has no past client that was really in the scale, and it still is in the wrong part of town. So she concluded that it may well be that a client will have to be, quote unquote, designed for the building. It is difficult for an 80-year-old building to find the right client, and this very special building will have a difficult search for the right client. So while she was hopeful and really thought it had use, she wasn't sure what should happen. She explored a department store, a market or shopping mall, an indoor Tivoli, like Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, a festival center, the idea of a year-round circus, a Civil War museum, a Corps of Engineers museum. But at the end of her study, she finally came to the conclusion that it was most appropriate as a gallery dedicated to the building of the arts. So her decision led a group of most illustrious people: Wolf von Eckhart, the architect of the Capitol; Joan Mondale, the wife of Eric Mendelsohn, the architect; Cynthia Field, historic preservationist at the Smithsonian, were all influential in getting Senator Charles Mathias of Maryland to initiate a bill for the General Services Administration to recognize the value of the pension building, calling it, I'll quote from this bill, "Unique, historic, constitutes an architectural treasure belonging to the people of the United States and must be restored and properly utilized," declaring it that it should be most appropriately dedicated to the public use as the nation's museum of the building arts, benefiting this and future generations. This was passed, and in 1980, they proceeded to begin a major renovation of the building so that it could in fact become a museum of the building arts. Kaiskan in Florence led a team with noted preservationist Giorgio Cavalieri and the Columbia University Conservation Lab led by Norman Weiss, structural engineer James Madison Cutts, and lighting designer Claude Engel to undertake numerous studies to determine the material conditions, the brick dome and floor capabilities, the humidification potential, as well as its potential to meet code. And you can see from this list, we got a new roof, tiles were restored, plaster details restored, columns repainted, and replacement busts were created because they'd all been lost by the time this was done in 1985. Greta Bader was the sculptress of these busts that were, there were 8 prototypical designs that were done of representing the different building trades. And that is what you see today if you go to the museum. So the museum in 1985 opens. It opens to great press, a golden age of DC museums, the city's 70th museum in Washington, DC. And it was a very exciting time. Bates Lowry, who was the first director, said, "Americans have been more apt to study the great palaces of Europe than our own architecture. This museum will try to see to it that at an early stage in their education, Americans know what our important buildings are and what a record those buildings are of their own society." When the museum was opened, it was dedicated, as we said, to the building arts, contractors, craftsmen, building suppliers, developers, engineers, architects, and planners. In 1997, it was actually renamed the National Building Museum. The museum is not the only tenant. We have the Commission of Fine Arts, the Advisory Council, among others, who are on the upper floors. But it is most, of course, what we know as a museum with exhibitions and activities that are of great note. It inspires curiosity about the world we design and build. There have been close to 300 exhibitions since the museum opened in 1985, and more than 500,000 visitors a year are clocked in. The exhibitions are catering to both children and adults. We also have in-house collection of artifacts. The collection includes 100,000 photographic images and negatives, 130,000 architectural prints and drawings, 100 linear feet of documents, and over 20,000 objects. They illuminate the building process, construction techniques, and documents changing architectural styles. And in fact, the core of the pension building collections includes a number of original elements that were recovered during the 1985 renovations. But not only is it for the exhibitions and scholars, there's also a really strong educational outreach program that reaches into the DC public schools, as well as to the public. We invite children to come, children of all ages to come and explore different things, including high school kids who do photography, as well as some of the fun events that you see here. However, not only educational outreach, we have awards that come. The Vincent Scully Prize is awarded every year for the excellence in practice, scholarship, or criticism in architecture, preservation, and urban design. An honor award recognizing individuals and organizations that make significant contributions to our built heritage, and the Henry Turner Prize for Innovation in Construction. The events are something you've probably are well aware of. Either you may have attended a charity event there, you may have watched the annual Christmas event from it's not the White House, but it's from the White House that is actually filmed in the Great Hall, and numerous parties and events that take place there. So not only can you walk in, or you could walk in to enjoy the museum, you could actually be invited to have dinner or dance or otherwise enjoy some kind of a program. Beyond this, we have something that has brought a great deal of attention. The brainchild of the fourth director, Chase Ryan, is the summer installations, or the summer block party. This has brought some of the most innovative architects, not only of the country, but of the world. In 2014, the York Ingalls Group, or BIG as they're known, did the big maze on the left. We have icebergs that James Corner Field Operations devised that was designed to be an interactive lesson in structural geometry, science, and a subtle warning of the beauty we stand to lose due to global warming. The Hive was designed by Studio Gang, a New York and Chicago architect, with 2,700 wound paper tubes, construction material that is recyclable, lightweight, and renewable. And then the Lawn from 2019. And though I don't have a picture of it, I'm sure many of you have memories of the beach, where the entire Great Hall was filled with sand. Unfortunately, we are not able to experience this coming summer, because in December 2nd, 2019, the museum closed because they had need to restore the floor. And Scott, who's going to follow me, will give you a lot of detail about what happened with this major renovation. And it was intended to be closed for 3 months. In February, they announced things were on schedule, and March 13th was the new opening. There would be a new visitor center. There would be new exhibitions, a major exhibition of architectural photographer Alan Kirchmer. But on March 12th, COVID shut the country down, and the museum has not been opened since that time. Plans for the 2020 summer block party that were developed in collaboration with the Folger Shakespeare Library, that was to feature William Shakespeare's house, have been postponed until the summer of 2021. But we are now fortunate enough that we're going to get a sneak preview of the rehabilitated Great Hall as I turn this show over to Scott Paden.
We were fortunate enough to be chosen in late summer of 2019 to be part of a design build team that would be working on rehabilitating the floor of the Great Hall. That team was led by the general contractor, the Meridian Group. We served as the architects. Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager were the structural engineers. The tower company did all of the carpentry and protection work, which is part of what we'll be talking about tonight. The repouring of the floor was Hardesty. North Star did the demolition excavation, and Lorton Stone did some of the minor terrazzo repairs that we had to deal with as we completed the project. The project manager for GSA, sorry about that, was Trish Gretzky, and the preservation specialist at GSA out of the OPDQ office, Sharon Feeney, and then of course you probably all know, if you were in preservation, Nancy Witherall, who serves as the Regional Historic Preservation Officer. The scope of work was fairly narrow, but demanding because of the time schedule we were on. So we had protection and monitoring, containment, deconstruction, and excavation, and then the repouring of a new floor of concrete and repairs to terrazzo. So one of the things that we like to say in our practice, and we are exclusively preservationists, that's all we do, is a building used is a building preserved. And it sounds a little simplistic, but it is to the heart of the matter. Once a building falls out of use, it begins to decay rapidly, and from there it can meet a pretty untimely fate. So keeping this building used, and Emily talked very eloquently about how that came to be, was important. The hall itself is a key fiscal component of the museum. And what you see here is Megs' original plan from 1883 with the beautiful lettering and his signature and things that we don't do anymore. And then a sketch of one of the capitals, which is really quite lovely. So, and Emily went over this, but I'm going to go through it real quickly. So 1883 to 84 construction. Inaugural balls were an important part of the use over the years. 1897 McKinley's, it was the first one held in the building, then to the GAO, then to the US Civil Service Commission. And I'd like you to focus in on that picture. These are all cubicles. And this was the demise of the floor. The original Mitten tile floor disappeared at this time, and it gave us the concrete slab that we inherited that was problematic and what prompted the effort. You can see here in 81, it's Ronald Reagan's ball. Everything is still painted white. And then, of course, one of the installations which Emily spoke about. So in a play on a building used as a building preserved, a great hall in use is a museum preserved. But because without the programs that take place in this incredible space that couldn't happen elsewhere, and the events and the rental of the hall, the museum would have a shortfall. And that is why our time frame for the project was so concentrated, because we had to take the building out of service and we had to keep it as short as possible. So we actually began either the day before or the day after Thanksgiving, and our period of performance was to turn it back over to the museum on February 15th. I think we were a few days early. Emily went over this, a couple more images different of the Great Maze by Big, the lawn, and then an image of the beach by Snarchitecture. And you can see it's actually being used for yoga classes as well as an exhibit. So these are incredibly important pieces. Where else in the city could you do installation pieces of this size? So critical in so many ways to the museum. And the floor on which all this rests had serious problems. Here's one of the galas from the LAB School Awards. There's no other space like this in the district, and it's very popular and very profitable. So new floor for a grand space. So this image on the left, which I think Emily had a smaller image in her presentation, is actually taken in 1918, a little over 100 years ago during the first great pandemic. So it seemed appropriate that it fell into the presentation. You can see here, if you look closely, that 20 some years after the building opened, the wear and tear is already showing up on the Mitten tile floor. What you can see right here, and I'll speak about it a little bit more later, is the presidential seal, the encaustic tile presidential seal, which is still in that location. I believe it's one of 4 seals created and the only one that remains in its current location. And that was an important piece that we had to work around during the work. This floor, from what we know from reading, was laid on a compacted bed and not necessarily on concrete. We don't know that for sure, but what we do know is when this floor was taken up, they did not do any subsurface preparation. They simply came in and poured concrete over dirt. And in some cases, it was 2.5 inches thick. In other cases, it was 6 inches thick. No vapor barrier, no rebar. And guess what? The Tiber Creek runs directly underneath. So the recurring problem, which had been addressed with various patches and half fixes, was that the concrete was delaminating, the carpet was kicking up, and in the end, it became a safety issue, and that was how the project was funded. So I'll take you through a little bit the process that we did to get from point A to point B. So during the pre-construction research, a lot of documents, HSR this more recent report from 2011 on the earthquake. And then we did some beginning forensic deconstruction. The biggest concern that we had in this effort was what was going to happen to the 8 monumental columns, what was supporting them, and what did we have to work around. So about a month and a half before we started, late one night, we went in and we dug some excavation next to the columns to ascertain what they were actually sitting on, and what the slab was resting on. And from that, we did some analysis and we proceeded with our design for both the protection of all of the surrounding historic fabric and the design of the flat slab itself. So the design of the slab was Simpson, Gumpert's, and Hager's job. And I don't know how well you can see it, but there were a variety of conditions that the slab had to address. The terrazzo was an immovable object. Of course, all the columns were immovable objects, including the Galleria columns. So as we work through this, there were a variety of conditions that were examined. The one in particular, because the scope of work did not include the restoration of the presidential seal, was how to keep that in place. And once we pulled all the concrete away from it, how it would stay in place so that when we came back, the new carpet met flush with the seal. So that was one of the big challenges. Also on the other side, you can see a blue line print from the 80s, which was the only document we had that spoke to what was sub-slab. And most of what is on this drawing was there, but then we found a variety of other surprises that needed to be dealt with. So this is stevedore preservation. This isn't glamorous. In fact, what we did, you can no longer see, but it is the foundation for the Great Hall continued use. And the protection was key to getting the project done. And you can see in this upper drawing elevations of the protection around the Galleria, both from the outside and the inside, and a cross section through showing how we designed these elements so that they were not attached to anything. They were self-supporting, and not only self-supporting, they supported the encapsulation of the space, which we had to do to contain dust and fumes and everything else. So one of the other things that was key to this project was not just understanding how we would address the columns with the slab, but how we would ensure or know that anything was actually moving. So Hillis Carnes came in and devised a monitoring program. The monitors were installed very specifically and with great care not to disturb any of the finishes on the extant historic fabric. That was hooked up, and we began to get readings, which were coming in 24/7. And it took a little while to fine tune it so we weren't bombarded, but we were able to ensure that that nothing moved during the course of the work. On the right, you'll see one of the mock-ups of the protection around the Galleria columns. And those were done ahead of time, prefabricated to an extent that we could, so that when we mobilized, we could do it quickly, so we could dedicate the majority of our time to the work at hand. So this is the beginning of the installation of the protection. We worked our way from the westernmost end of the hall east. So this area where you see everything staged behind the 4 western monumental columns was the first area of demolition. We had to get the equipment back there, and we had to get it back in and out frequently and smoothly. So this snaking corridor went through the first set of columns around and back, and that was done So we wouldn't have any blind corners with equipment and pedestrians or workers moving back and forth. This is one of my favorite images of the work because to me, it looks like one of the installations that we saw earlier that were intended. Here you can see the beginning of the encapsulation. We actually had to use equipment that was gas-powered, propane powered. So we had to not only contain the dust of the deconstruction of the slab, but we also had to contain the exhaust from the equipment and get it out of there to keep the workers safe. So we had monitors in there for air quality. We had industrial hygienists coming and checking that on a regular basis, so that we knew that we were keeping everybody safe working, but also in the building, because the upper floors of the building, although it wasn't open to the public, were occupied, continued to be occupied by Commission of Fine Arts and the Building Museum. So that was critical. Here you can see a little bit more, and the diagram at the bottom is one of the initial diagrams of how we were going to get additional air out of the spaces with the air scrubbers, taking it out the sidewall and then out through the entrance. We ended up not having to do this. We were able to accomplish it without that, but a lot of the details and things that we needed to address were done on grid paper by hand in order to keep up with the demands of the work. So the actual deconstruction, and we're saying deconstruction because demolition and preservation, I think, are not two words that belong together. And we weren't demolishing, we were deconstructing what was there and then reconstructing something in its place. So that was done very carefully. And with a lot of handwork. The equipment was mostly moving what we broke up in and out, not doing the demolition itself, deconstruction. What you see in the upper right is the hull under complete containment. So the containment moved and continued as we continued our work. This is near the end of the project. And what was interesting about that is it was the lung of the building, and when we would open the doors to move equipment in and out, it would inflate, and then as it closed it would deflate. So if you were up watching this going on, that's really all you saw. So building museum employees and CFA employees never really saw any of what you're seeing in these images, because it was a contained space and no one was allowed in except the personnel. So this is what they saw until it was unveiled. You see two of our air scrubbers there, a lot of things gone. You can see some of the protection around one of the monumental columns. And also, if you look at the bottom of that, you can see how close we had to get to the existing foundation without damaging these beautiful terracotta bases, especially the bottom torus. We had to get under it with the slab. So that was all excavated more as if it was an archaeological dig than a construction site. And so it took a little training and a lot of oversight to make sure it was done that way, but we escaped without one of the column bases being harmed. So then, once things were done, we had to, in terms of the removal of the existing slab, we had subsurface work that had to be done. We had to put down a proper base. We brought in new electrical so that the events could be hooked up in a more efficient way, because the in and out of events really is hard on the building. You know, these people are moving in, they're staging events, they're not as careful as they should be. And one of the worst things that happens is the running of cords here and there to make things work. So by installing new boxes that were distributed properly with electrical tele and data, it makes the wear and tear on the building as it goes back into service much less. If you look in the lower right, you know, we're doing this and we're rolling with the punches because of the time schedule. after we did one of the first pours, we realized that our protection was a little too close to the edge of the terrazzo, and it wasn't allowing the concrete finishers to do what they needed to do. So we actually had to back up all the protection, which, because it wasn't attached, was actually not that difficult. But because we had it right up against the base of the gallery columns, we had to create little windows, flip them up so that we could move the rest of the protection back. And that's what you see. Again, to me, it looks a little bit like an installation. So it was interesting to watch that over the course of the project. And here we are nearing the end. Originally, the plan was to pour this in 6 sections. Take out one section, move to the next section opposed, and begin removing concrete there, pour that section, and sort of checkerboard our way back to the end. After one iteration of that, we realized it was going to be more efficient, and we'd be better off both with the quality of the pour and everything else if we did it all at once or in larger pours. What then threw a monkey wrench into what we were doing is we discovered 2 major voids under the galleries, where when they had done subsurface infrastructure work, they had not filled them back up. So we had these 2 large voids that were structurally unsound. They hadn't moved, but certainly in the future with enough wear and tear, they would. So we had to address those, design what the remediation would be. So we jumped the whole way to the eastern end, poured that, and then we had to go back and do the middle separately. And then demobilization. What I'd like to say about this is, because of the pre-planning, because of the way the protection was designed and constructed, it was taken apart, and all of the lumber, or most of the lumber, I'd say 80%, was salvaged. The majority of that, some of it stayed to help the museum with their work. The majority of that, I believe, went to Habitat for Humanity. And it was a large amount of materials, and we felt that was in the mission of GSA and the mission of the project, and certainly within the mission of the building museum. It should also be mentioned that and we'll go to lessons learned. So protect, 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 and protect some more. The building is at its highest risk while we're actually doing our work. So it's kind of ironic that the preservation and conservation work we do puts the building at its highest risk level. So as much as you think the protection is there, it's usually never enough. And it's not just the design and installation of the protection, but the monitoring of it as the work goes on. Things get displaced, things get moved, we're on a tight time schedule. So part of our job, once all of this was up, was to frequently go and make sure it was in place and doing its job. Because we used Finnish carpenters to help design in concert with us and fabricate the protection, it did its job remarkably well. Never really failed at any point, and provided an environment that the construction crews could get their work done safely without endangering the building. And I don't believe we could have done that with regular framing carpenters. As good as they may be, it's not the skill level that we needed. Deconstruction, not demolition. I spoke about that earlier. I think it holds true. When we talk about preservation and we do this work, we really should be using the word deconstruction, not demolition. Don't overestimate those that came before you. The encountering of those 2 large voids in 2020 hindsight, you look at those and you say to yourself, how did that happen? So even though that building looked as it should in many ways, we uncovered some things that shouldn't have been there. Luckily, we were able to take care of them. Be nimble, meaning you've got to be adept at dealing with all these things that come up as you peel back the layers of the onion. I think design build is the only way to do that effectively with a historic structure, and especially with a limited time schedule. Too many cooks spoil the broth, and I mean that in that with a project like this, the smaller the group of people working on it, the better it will be, the more efficient it will be. Bigger projects, we were the preservation oversight architects for the old post office. So many people in and out of that building so often, it really was at risk far more than it would have been if the division of labor had been more concentrated. Choose your partners wisely. So I don't know how many of you know Andrea Mones, who was the Regional Historic Preservation Officer for GSA during the first modernization of the old post office, but she said two things that have always stuck with us. First, we work for the building, meaning first and foremost, we are there to help continue the building's history, to be good stewards, and to sometimes push back at the tenants, the owners, whoever else is involved with it. So the building is paramount. And we don't practice on our buildings. So that means we don't pick a partner for a project like this we haven't worked with before. So the core team needs to be a group of people who maybe not have worked side by side, hopefully they have, but that there's a cross-pollination between the partners that means we know what we're dealing with and what to expect. And in our case, we had worked with everybody on the team prior numerous times. And then once you have that team, you have to trust the people you're working with. It doesn't mean to drop the oversight. It doesn't mean you blindly go where they point you, but there has to be a certain level of trust in order to get the work done within the budget, the time, and all the while keeping the building safe. And this is the end, both of my part of the program, and also this is the last photograph I took as we closed the doors. Soon after this, the carpet was returned, a new carpet identical to the one that was removed. And you will never see this, or at least hopefully I will never see this concrete again. Thank you all, and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Emily. That was just wonderful. I always learn whenever you guys speak. I always learn something amazing. We've got a bunch of questions that have come in. So if Emily, if you could join back with us, we'll try and get to those over the next 10 or 15 minutes as we have here. Emily, there are a couple of questions that came in that I think maybe in your portfolio. One of the questions was about electricity and heat. When it was, it had all this natural ventilation as you talked about, but when did it actually get, when was it electrified, and I actually don't know. What's the heating system like?
I do not know the answer to that. I have to admit. Maybe Scott, do you know the answer? I mean, there originally was electricity of some sort. It was early, the 1880s, there was electricity. But I don't want to speak to this because I'm really not that knowledgeable about it, but it's a very good question.
I think that's probably better answered by the museum itself. This scope of work, other than adding some electrical feeds, didn't involve anything to do with the mechanical system. So I can't answer.
Well, thank you.
There was some heating that took place there. Obviously Megs was very innovative and was using, let us say, cutting edge technology in the building. So electricity and some kind of a radiator or type heat. And you had like a heat gravity system that was in there. so that, you know, we're circulating heat and cold air throughout. But it's a good question, really good
It is a good
question.
question. That's one of the best things about these forums. You always get a question like, huh, yeah, okay, let's
Right.
find out. And another question I think that's been asked many times about the Megs busts that were there. Do we know what happened to the Megs busts? Are they in somebody's patio in Georgetown?
Well,
or where are the Megs busts?
Well, I think the first question is, what were they of? And that we do know that they were of, you know, Megs himself, his wife, and historic military figures were the 244 of them. Certainly, it made sense that he would be included. I found it fascinating that his wife also, he decided to, you know, he obviously respected women at an early, you know, very nicely. They were gone by 1929, which is before the GAO moved in. They were gone, so they were probably, you know, they were removed probably when the Pension Bureau moved out. They may well be tucked somewhere in our government's, you know, attic. You know, I've come across many odd and sundry things that have been put away for storage that no one even knows they exist. But you find like at the Yards has all kinds of, at the Yards, which was the Southeast Federal Center, which was the Navy Yard. There's a building there, Building 202, has lots of stuff in its attic. That building's never been rehabbed yet. And it's got all kinds of things that are parts of buildings. So I bet they're somewhere. But they were gone by 29. And we, as I said, we do know that that they were replaced by contemporary sculptor, Greta Bader, doing the 8 building trades, but military figures first. So.
Thank you, Emily. So Scott, the next bunch is for you, I think, in terms of gathering. Was restoration and rehabilitation of the 3 other seals ever considered? And is the one seal that's restored, is it in its original location?
Okay, so I have no idea where the 3 other seals are. In fact, the seal that is in place, it shows up in one of the Park Service briefs on tile. There's a picture of it and talk about it. Unfortunately, we did not get to restore the seal. It was not in the scope of work. So all we did was protect it and make sure it didn't move. Now, we did do some designs for further protection and submitted price estimates to do the restoration, and hopefully that will happen in the not too distant future. But it is, as it was, it's cleaner than it was when we started. So it got a minor cleaning, and there were some loose tiles that got reset. But other than that, it is as it was.
Thanks, Scott. Another question came in about live load and dead load, and I don't know what that means. So let me know.
So that was an important part of the slab design. If you look at all of those images of the events, there was a lot of weight, point loads in particular, especially with scaffolding. A lot of those exhibits you saw are all scaffolding, and then they're wrapped. So that was a big concern. So the design of the slab was done in a way to handle all of the loads that are regularly put on it and anticipated loads in the future. So that was part of SEG's design task.
Great. The next question is about how far, and I actually wondered this, how far below the floor today, the carpet today, did you actually excavate?
So I believe and I'm obviously not looking at the drawings, I believe we have a 6-inch bed of crushed stone. And then I believe the slab is 5 or 6 inches thick. So about a foot down, because as I said earlier, in some places, the slab was only 2 inches thick.
Great. Okay, interesting. Then another question came in about the south side basement and the status of that. Was that part of your project, Scott?
So there is a basement all along the south side. which is interesting because the only original subsurface excavation was for the boiler or the heating plant. And then as they did the excavation on that corner, they realized that it was just going to be as easy or easier to excavate the entire south side. So as we did our work, we had to examine that north basement wall, how it came up and carried the gallery columns, and how it was, what job it was doing in resisting the lateral loads placed on it by using the hull. It was determined by SGH that it was fine the way it is, but it was also monitored during the construction to make sure that it did not move, which it didn't.
Excellent. Another basement question away, and I think everyone wants to know, what's the foundation like under the monumental columns?
So we only saw the upper portion, but the drawings show it, and this is fairly typical, as a stepped pyramid of masonry. So, and it's probably, and you know, I'm just grabbing a little bit at straws here, but if I remember the drawing, it probably goes down 12 to 15 feet. And I would say at its base, it might be, so the columns are 8 feet in diameter. It might be 32 by 32 at the bottom, and then it just steps up brick course by brick course until it reaches the base of the column where it starts to take the circular shape. So we only saw the first couple of steps from the base down.
Fascinating. That really, that would be interesting to see. I don't know that we won't ever have to see it, but it would be fascinating to see. And then finally, a question more about decoration and colors. That maybe someone else might know is the decoration and colors that we're using now in the actual building. I presume that that's something you all didn't do in working on it, Scott. Emily, do you know more about the preservation efforts that have been done over the years within the building?
Well, I do know that they, in 1985, they did paint analysis. Mm-hmm. And then they painted the columns very quickly because Reagan's inaugural ball was imminent. And there was a lot of a discussion about, you know, were those the right colors and the like. And then in 2000, they repainted them to supposedly more accurately do the colors, but I'm not sure that's true. I don't know for sure because I've never seen the reports. I would very much like to see what was the report from 85 and if maybe we just didn't like the colors, because very often when you do paint analysis, the colors that come up don't suit our contemporary mores, so to speak. And chances are that those were the right colors and the ones that were done in 2000 were just more, you know, more compatible with our current, you know, taste. But I don't know, you know, other than those two facts, that 85 and 2000.
Emily, so, didn't John Canning do the scagliola on the columns? Wasn't that the firm who did
I
it?
trust that you know that. Yeah,
I think that's who did the original scagliola.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, so, and as always, sorry.
No, I'm just going to say, I mean, if chances are he knew what he was doing and he did it correctly, but say not everyone always likes the results by contemporary taste.
Right. Well, and as always with these kind of open formats, several of the questions and several of the in the Q&A, people have been answering some of the questions that others have asked for. And isn't that just great in terms of the community of practice that we have here? And we all share that. We're all better for that, to be sure. Emily, I just wanted to we got a few more minutes, and I wanted to sort of put this building in perspective from your expertise and such. Where does this building really stand in sort of the pantheon of great American architecture from even within the late 19th century? I mean, it has that horrible or wonderful nickname of the Old Red Barn. Clearly, not everyone likes things, and you were talking about taste and how they changed. What, in your estimation, though, the things you've seen over the career, where does it really lie in that larger story?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, the fact that it was designed by, you know, Megs was so creative and you know, just so talented, and that he saw the opportunity to make this very large space and make it light and airy. I think that, and using the Italian inspiration, you know, it's not like you could just go on the internet and find something back then, you know, it was I think the idea of transferring that design of a palazzo and what it was trying to do into something that would be an interior office space was very ingenious. And the, you know, calling it, it was just very large. It was red brick, and the, who knows what was behind that. But I think it really is a very interesting building in the history of American architecture. I really do, because it does blend the innovation, technology, the aesthetic of transferring European aesthetic that in the way that it did for a modern purpose, almost a, you know, something we might adaptively do today. And so I think it is very important building.
Right, right. Indeed. And I think also we all share that idea of the fact that it's built not only for a practical purpose as an office building, but that it's for a veteran to have built a building as a memorial.
Right.
Is a pretty telling story, and to be sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's very very, very telling, to be sure. Now, Scott, right. I want to go back to you for just a second, because I found what you described in terms of the building used as a building preserved. We were talking the other day about Hugh Miller's story of, you know, maintenance equals preservation, and effectively what you're doing, it's rehabilitation, but it's really not the same scale of that. And you must do, is that what most of your practice is in this kind of general practitioner kind of work?
Yes. So we have been exceedingly fortunate the 10 years that we've been working in Washington and moved our practice here to do a wide range of projects. But I would say that a lot of what we do, at least 50%, is putting Band-Aids on scraped knees, setting broken arms, maybe a little bit of reconstructive surgery here and there. And it's so critical to the long term. You know, buildings decay slowly over time without, you know, unless it's a war or a natural disaster. And the threads get pulled and pulled and pulled and pulled. And if there's nobody there to darn the sock, pretty soon your feet are cold. And what we take great pleasure in is the research that we need to do what we have to do, because you learn all of this great history that Emily is talking about as you try and figure out the means and methods that were used to make the building, because you need to know that to preserve the building. Our other good fortune with our practice is my partner, who does that part of the practice and more, has written, I think now, 11 historic structure reports, 9 of those with traceries. So we get to delve into things far deeper when we do work like that than we do with work like this. And so if you're a historian and you love buildings, being a preservationist is a great way to practice.
Right. Absolutely. We love working with Scott.
There we are.
His people, it's great.
Well, it's a mutual admiration society here tonight. And that's a wonderful thing.
Yes.
Well,
terrific job. Everything was great. Loved it. I can answer a few things. Emily, got to have faith. You're right. People look at colors and they say, ah, but this was the building museum. And we said, no, we have to do what we found. Every color was done. And, you know, we thought it would be horrible. It was Bates who said, we're going to do the right thing. And we did the right thing. Every color's right. What happened with the columns was it was sloppily done. It didn't look like marble. It looked like it was fake. So it was redone properly later with canning. There was one color field that was never put on, but that is the only one. The rest of the colors are real. The systems, I saw the radiators. before
Right,
when
right.
They were taken out,
Yeah.
and they were massive. They were cast iron, and you can tell from what you found in the South excavation that there were boilers, and that's what the heating system was.
Right.
We wanted to put in electricity for the lighting, and he also wanted to put in an elevator. These are in his notes. He reported everything yearly to the government, and it was at that point where, you know, putting electricity in was a little scary. He wanted it for the Great Hall, and they wouldn't do it. So Bates suggested, I think it was Bates suggested, that when we did put those lights in, that they would look like they were early electric bulbs. If you can remember back, I don't think they're still there, but they were made out of glass, and they looked they didn't look modern. And it was his idea to suggest that maybe Megs early electric lights could have been put in there. But that's what he wanted, electric lights in the Great Hall, around the side.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, John, and this would certainly be a talk for another time, but the foremost expert in the country on period lighting is Dan Matosh, who lives up on Capitol Hill in an Appleton C. Clark Jr. house, which in itself is a museum. It's entirely lit by gas. But I'm sure he could
Oh
tell
my
you,
gosh.
I'm sure he could tell you everything you need to know about what the building was like at that time.
Great.
And certainly someone that would be a great speaker in the future.
Super, Scott. Thank you much. Hey, so from the founding director, Ms. Field, thank you so much for coming on. Let's turn it over to the acting director. Frank, a few words to close out.
Yes, thank you. And this was a tremendous program. I could listen. I want more and more and more about the building, about the preservation, about the history. Thank you, John, Emily, Scott, and Cynthia for your contributions to this really important program. And like many great programs, that you've answered many questions, and you've also raised a number of questions. And one issue that I've been interested in since becoming acting or interim executive director is the presence or absence of African Americans in the pension building. And I did a little bit of research with the help of building museum staff, and Megs included only one African American, one Black man who's a Teamster. He's not a soldier. And we all know the major contributions of the what was called the U.S. colored troops. Hundreds of thousands, many military historians, I think, credit the U.S. colored troops with turning the tide of the war. And yet there's only one African-American, a Black Teamster, and he appears over the at the entrances, I think each entrance. And Megs insisted that he be a Black Teamster. He must be, quote, he must be a Negro, a plantation slave freed by war. So I think there's an interesting story to be told there. And I'm also interested in the actual building of the museum. How many African Americans were probably involved in the workforce that with 15.5 million bricks, I have to believe there was a pretty sizable workforce. So what do we know about that story? So anyone watching this program, and there's more to be discovered, but we really have to thank John and Emily, Scott and Cynthia for such a wonderful program. And thanks to our great team at the National Building Museum, Paul Kilmer, Jamie Telford, Rachel Weber, Braulio Ignacy, and the whole staff. We're putting together this birthday celebration. As I mentioned, our birthday officially is December 12th, 1980, when President Carter signed the legislation authorizing the National Building of the Arts. Our Our celebration continues tomorrow at noon with a live online event with architecture photographer Alan Karchmer, who will guide viewers through the museum's exhibition of his work, Alan Karchmer, the architect's photographer. This exhibition will be available to visitors when the museum reopens in 2021, and we will reopen in 2021. Our week-long celebration concludes on Saturday with a video tour of the museum's collection, a virtual tour of the museum's home in the historic pension building, and a video overview of our past and our future, along with memories and well-wishers from members of our community. So tune in, look at find the details on our website, nbm.org. And finally, tonight's program on historic preservation has been recorded, and an edited version will be available within 10 days. Thank you, stay safe, and good night.